Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors Podcast. I'm Neil Thomas, and this is my co-host, Kevin Janes.
In this series, Neil and I are interviewing improvisers about their histories, their practices, what informs their practices conceptually, and their aspirations.
And today we're in conversation with Frank van der Ven.
Great.
Good morning, Frank. So good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Improvisers Podcast.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here, excited. Thanks for inviting me.
It seems that the biggest influence in your work and your life is body weather. Maybe tell us a bit about body weather, how you came to it, what it is, and
there is one other. There's one other what I consider an influence, which is it's somewhere in my biography, and I can just mention it, and then we'll go on to body weather. But I did work as a young person for a month with Richard Cislak of the Grotowski Laboratory, when the Grotowski Laboratory had just disbanded. And although that was only for a month, and I worked with 10 years with Min Tanaka and the Maijuku Performance Company, I still consider that as a genuine influence into my work. But that's a sideline. We start with a sideline. That's good. Body weather, Min Tanaka. Oh my God, yeah, it's oh wow, it's a big story. But let's go. I was in Holland, and friends of mine had organized Min Tanaka, the founder of Body weather, Min Tanaka's first venture into the Netherlands, which was in 1981, and I went to see this performance, and I remember quite vividly because the audience was standing on stage, looking at the audience, see the velvet, like it was a municipal theater, velvet seats, and in the middle over there was a naked body, slightly brown painted all over, just moving very, very, very slowly, on the top of the edges, on the top of the seats, just like rolling towards us. And it was an incredibly captivating image. Really like, oh my God. But at the same time, I couldn't find any words to describe it. And I couldn't understand, why. I mean, why is this so captivating? And I got very, very irritated because how can it be that something just gets under my skin so much and I can't really describe it. So I got really fascinated and irritated and angry. So I signed up for workshops with him and with Min Tanaka, and did a few in Paris and in Holland. And then with another group of people, we tried to put up make a center in France somewhere, a body weather center. But we were all young and we had no experience and no money and no insights whatsoever. So that didn't happen. And then Min did invite me to Japan to join one of the intensive training periods, which he had just started. And I went to Japan and stayed there for 2 months for the training period. And that ended up in staying for half a year, and was invited to a tour in Europe and in Japan, and to join the company with performances. And then we did this European tour in 1983 already, yes, 1983, maybe 84. And then after that tour, I went back to see my family. And after that, I decided to go to Japan for a longer period. And I ended up staying almost 10 years. So that's a little bit the beginning of my work with Min Tanaka and the Maijuku Performance Company. And those 10 years, it sounds like a really long time. And of course, it is a long time, but also things were evolving constantly. We had a training lab in the outskirts of Tokyo. And then in 85, we moved to a farm in the countryside and started the farm little by little, grassroots. We just borrowed some fields and then got an old farm which we restored, And then there was a festival was installed in that farm. People coming from abroad and from Japan to work with us, and there were tours. And then there was also, maybe interesting to mention, that the first butoh festival in Japan. That was the first time that butoh was nationally recognized in Japan, in the sense that it was being broadcast by NHK, and there were like 10 big performances of everybody. Ono and Hijikata himself didn't perform, but he went along to all the groups to give some feedback and just talk and about history and other things. And yes, Sankei Juku performed, Min Tanaka and Maijuku, and Milford Graves, an African-American drummer, just passed away 2 years ago. And Ariadone, not Ariadone, and lots of other groups. And that was the first time that that butoh was put on the map in Japan. It was, I think, known internationally more than in Japan itself at that time. Next question.
You mentioned butoh and
yes.
weather.
Sorry.
Can you speak of the relationship between them?
Ooh, that'll take the rest of this podcast. Yes, I'll say something about it because it is a very pertinent question, and it's always been asked, and it's also very, very complicated. Min Tanaka knew as a young man, of course, the work of Hijikata, which started in the late 50s, early 60s, but he told me that it was too strong for him, that if he would work directly with Hijikata, he would be burned because like a sunlight too strong. So he didn't do that. He went to work by himself and with other people, and developed little by little over many, many years this whole concepts and thoughts about body weather. And then actually when I was there in 1984, because I arrived in 83, he actually published a letter in the newspaper, which, and still you can find that text online. It's called "I am an avant-garde who crawls on the earth." And in that letter, it's only 2 pages, very, very, very dense. He says, Hijikata, who was in seclusion, he kind of had withdrawn from the performing world. He asks him to come back to the public eye, and also says, I am now ready to work with you. I am your true son, although they had never met. So he publishes this in the newspaper. And Hijikata responded to that somehow. I don't know exactly how. And then they decided to work together for a performance in 84, which is called Reinai Butoh Ha. And it was Hijikata choreographing. But the way of working was quite interesting to mention, actually, because in the morning, Hijikata would choreograph on Yoko Ashikawa, which was his first main muse and dancer. And then in the afternoon, so his body, in the afternoon, Min Tanaka would come in, and then with the transference of body to body, learning what was being taught in the morning. And then in the evening, Min would come back to the studio in Hachioji, where we were, and would go again through all the material with one of his dancers. So there was a real long process, very, very intense for 3 months. And then he did 2 nights of performances. And I had the luck that I was helping out backstage for that performance with Yoko Ashikawa, because there was one moment that Min, he kind of stormed off stage, all sweaty and brown and dirty. And in the course of, and there was probably some music going on or some change shift. And in the course of about 1 minute, there was 6, 7 people around him would just turn him from brown to white with makeup, the whole body. So and then he would storm back on stage, being completely white. And another thing I remember from the performance was like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of images, physical images being worked upon. And then just before the performance, Hijikata saying to Min, now just forget about everything and go out and dance. So that's, I'm drifting off a bit, but that relation between body weather and butoh is very complicated because although Min had an absolute great reverence for Hijikata, and having worked like this and so intense, and he also considered that that butoh kind of died with Hijikata. This cannot be reproduced, his work. And Min has always, although in Japan for many, many years, he has supported butoh in a way, for example, to invite all young dancers into his festival to come and try things out and develop. And I think especially abroad, he has kept his distance from butoh. He says, I'm not a butoh dancer. I'm just a dancer. I want to be anonymous. I don't want to be kept caught in a style. And actually for his workshops, he actually had a disclaimer on his website saying, we are not butoh. If you come to learn butoh, please don't come, because it's not what we're doing. And so there's this absolute reverence and really feeling spiritually and, in heart and in everything else very, very close to Hijikata and Hijikata's work. There's also a divergence that body weather is not the same as butoh. So that's a long and complicated history that continues to this day. And, and people in workshops often ask, or almost always ask about it. And one thing I answer is that, although that butoh is a little bit more of, there's an aesthetics involved, although that the aesthetics are pretty wide because there's very many different styles of butoh. There's people working very poetically, more dark and theatrical, or there's so many styles of butoh that they still have an aesthetic. And it is said that body weather has a little bit more of an open agenda and looks more at the nuts and bolts of movements, or a little bit at what's going on before expression, before we start to move body to express something. So that's one of the and then some people say you can't, that's not true, because you cannot not have an aesthetic. So yeah, that's an ongoing discussion, and they are aligned, coming from the same, roughly a little bit later, but roughly from the same era and time, but yeah, a little bit different. An uneasy alliance sometimes, and sometimes a happy alliance.
Listening to you talk about your time in Japan made me wonder what it was like post-Japan. Such an immersion in a Dutch man going into Japan, relatively young, immersing yourself in the Japanese culture, and the extremities and the dedication and the commitment, all that's required. And so now, and then leaving Japan, I imagine, how was that? How was that?
Oh yeah, that was a big one. I stayed a little bit in touch with Europe, but not much, because I would come back to visit family and then go back to Japan again. And then when I finally did leave, I think the biggest culture shock happened then, because it was such an intense time in Japan. First of all, because the training was just always very intense, and then the whole performance. We would perform so much and tour, and Min would perform and solo, and we did such an incredible variety of things, like solos and duos and group performances and performances inside and outside, and choreographed and improvised, and only men or only women performance groups of 30 people, 40 people. I mean, such an abundance, with such an intensity, that when I came back to Europe, there was two things actually. First of all, which is not such a good thing. We felt like Navy SEALs. We thought, oh, now I'll go back to Europe and everybody will be waiting for me. And, and of course that was not the case, rightly so, because, the real culture shock to relive that intensity that took quite a few years to land back here and actually start from zero, start training people, start working with people, start finding networks again. And of course, also in the beginning, my best dance would be a little, not so interesting imitation of Min's work. To process all of that intensity, to process that and to turn it over and to land in a new, well, my world, but 10 years later, to land in a new environment and make that work. That took quite a few years. And I think in retrospect that what really happened to make me find my own voice was to do a long project to working around the theories of Deleuze and Guattari, which I heard that Tony also mentioned. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, two French philosophers. They wrote a big book they wrote many philosophical books, but one is called 1,000 Plateaus. And in 1,000 Plateaus is a chapter called How to Make Yourself a Body Without Organs. And we, with a group of people, we changed that into How to Make Yourself a Dancing Body Without Organs. And it was, dealing with that highly philosophical imagery and highly philosophical notions of territorialization and deterritorialization. It is through that I could pour all the things that I learned in Japan into that, and that kind of propelled something a little bit more original into my the dance of the people that at that time, I think, in retrospect.
Frank, you've taught extensively in Europe and in Australia. What is it, I'm wondering, that Frank now offers with Body Weather? What is it that you bring in your teaching, or how has Body Weather as a form morphed under your approach? Are you willing to comment on that? How you go about teaching, and what it is that is important in this sort of contemporary time?
Yeah. Ooh, that's not a big question. And a very good question. I think that in butoh, and and not that I pretend to know everything about it, but I think it seems to be continuing to research a thing that's already has been researched. Although you could argue, butoh is about life and death, and there's always a new approach to that. There's always, always has to come to terms with that. Any generation has to do the same thing. But I do find when I see contemporary butoh that it's, it's a little bit, well, I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I think, and that's just me, I think that we need something else today. Butoh was a response to a very specific time and era, and things going on in society. And I think now there's slightly different things going on, and we should find slightly different approaches. I think dance needs to be different and needs to be elsewhere. And then what that is, of course, that's a big question. But I do think that Body Weather, because it is an open, of course, open doesn't really exist, but it is an open investigation into what's going on now. It has the chance to adhere to the things here at present more than in a very good way. So what I have now the fortune to step into a workshop, even a big 10 15 day workshop, go in with an open agenda. And of course, I lead the first few days, and I set it up, and there's some things that come back, and of course of that, but also I can really attune to what's needed and what's going on in a group, and where are people interested in, and also what's my perception of what are they interested in, but what would be really of use for them to delve out. Where are the lacunae, where are the gaps? What needs to be done here? What can I offer them to be a more round up practice, or a rounded practice, a more mature practice, or more where are the spaces to develop things. So body weather in the beginning was like an open investigation on both sides of the skin. We thought of skin as being slightly transparent, or and I think that a lot of what was there in the early days of body weather has been taken on in other dance styles as well. A body not being hierarchical. This dance can happen anywhere. A dance can be many more things. But I still think that body weather has a lot to offer these days, because of its multi-layeredness and of its richness. We work on speed and fragmentation and images, and how text and movement go together. And to say a little bit about my own practice, being trained in such a way that everything is in flux and in state has set me up to, fortunately, still invent new things today. So, I'll be in a workshop, and some little coin, something drops, and oh my God, I never did that before. Let's do it. Just combining two things, or just copy something complete new, and yeah, that's a very, very pleasant and luxury state to be in. Just to be able to do that.
I was talking with Kevin before this interview about the two words body weather, and what a wonderful coincidence of words, and how evocative it is, and how it's intriguing and stimulating. And while you were talking, I was thinking or imagining that this notion of the weather, and you going into a workshop and feeling the weather of the players, their needs, their desires, their aspirations, and you feeling that. So it's almost as if your weather is meeting their weather in that situation. So and it seems like it's fundamentally a body-based practice, and moving towards this notion of sort of rupturing the skin and joining the weather, and allowing the weather to come in and out in all of its, the mental weather, the emotional weather, the physical weather, all of the weathers. And it made me think about the politics of theatre and performance and practice, and this the history being that butoh was quite anarchic in its beginnings, and that was quite strongly political and wanting to bring about change. It was and I'm wondering whether that's something that body weather is concerned with now, the sort of the politics of the now. If you talk a little bit about that.
The body weather is indeed a very evocative. I can say a few little things about it. Politics, I'll just make that I don't forget. Thinking about weather, there's many things if we start thinking about it. And also, I should say, Peter Snow, who wrote a PhD on body weather, he really thought a lot about that, and we talked a lot about that. And in Japan, we talked a lot about that anyway. Weather, there's always some weather. There's never no weather. So weather is always there, but it's always also highly specific. there is some kind of weather, either snows or it rains or it's cold or it's wet. And I think we like to think that bodies have weather, and then if you come to think like that, then different body parts have different weathers, so they relate different to each other all the time. And there is also a total body weather, and there's also a weather between two bodies, and there's also something like a group weather. And then there's, of course, there's also something like cosmic weather, and there's also that things that the wing of a butterfly influences a big storm on the other side of the world, and there's macro weather and micro weather. And the temperature just above the ground is different than 1 meter and 100 meters. So there's a lot of things to think about weather. And then if you ask about politics of it, I do think, and I don't think that's where it also comes from the history, but I still think that even now it has a kind of new life. I do think that knowing one's body and being aware of one's body and being aware of movement or aware of how body and mind interact is in itself a political act, because it makes you independent from the powers that are over you, and it gives you a little bit. We say you can't really change the weather, but you can navigate the weather differently. So that's a very broad. It's not party politics, but I do think that, and I feel that responsibility also when I teach, that making people more independent by knowing more about themselves is part of the work. And although you say that's correct, it is a strongly body-based practice, but there's always been a lot of attention for and interest in how thinking and moving interact and are influenced on each other, how they influence each other. I kind of developed a whole line of work around improvising speech and improvising movement. And one of the premises is that, movement and speech or text or language are always connected very, very strongly. So in my practice, I try to disconnect them. So really, it's almost like doing two things at the same time. Have a different physical score and a different vocal score. And my line of thinking is that the more you can separate them, which is a big struggle, the more you can then bring them together in a little bit more free choice. Because if you can't separate them, they always will be together in the same way. Whereas you can separate them, then you have a little bit more leeway in choosing how. And of course, especially happens when when there's a lot of intensity going on. When there's intense physical movement, then the voice tends to get intense as well, either in emotional state or in vocal, in loudness or in quickness. But actually, if you try to move very, very slowly, but a very intense physical vocal score, or the other way around, you just get very, very interesting results. And you just enter a little territory that's just there and available to explore. So I was drifting off from the politics, but as a mind and body, yeah. So there's a lot of attention for mind and body as well in that sense, yeah. And that, I think, has not really specific, but has a big political side to it.
Yeah. Frank, thanks for dropping the word improvisation in here.
Yes.
Having done some work with you and have some awareness of how you sort of lead us towards, in some ways, breaking down patterns in order to gain access to putting things together in other ways. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But we've interviewed many improvisers who've come from a range of backgrounds, each with their own, informed by their own concepts of improvisation and performance. Yeah. I'm wondering what further you might add to this conversation about what is improvisation for you, What does being available to things that emerge in the moment, what does it imply to actually be available to things other than ourselves or more than ourselves? Where does improvisation sit for you, this word itself, when it comes to either the teaching that you do or the performance that you're involved in? I'd love to hear you comment around this area.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, another good big question. I think before I went to Japan, coming from the West, there's a lot about self-investigation, and the deeper you go into yourself, the more you find, and that of course is true. But working with Min Tanaka and in Japan for 10 years, he would also speak to us about diving deep outside of yourself. And a little anecdote for that, which is really funny and quite interesting, is the trainings that we were doing were really very intensive. It was like jumping and till exhaustion and toppling over. That was just how we trained. And Min would always really laugh about us, because he would say, "Ha ha ha ha! Those Europeans, when they get tired, they become so individual." And then that really struck a bell with me, because I thought, this is like one of the biggest expressions that I have. I'm just tired, I just can't, he said, everybody's caving in on themselves when you're tired. And then to actually become aware that that's just a pattern. It doesn't have to be like that. People it's a generalization, of course. I know that is, but there's many other different possibilities. You could actually go outside and ask for help. There's no. So if then become aware that that's just a cultural tradition where you were born and raised in, and that it can be quite different, that's quite an eye opener. So improvisation now, improvisation has changed. I can have a few things I can say about it. One thing is to be deeply insight on self and deeply aware of your surroundings. Just so it's this constant back and forth. We're always, there's never a pure state. We're always, somewhere somewhat inside and somewhat outside. But in my teaching and in my improvisations, that has become a real field of research. Where are we? Are we now 40% inside and 86% outside? Or are we, and can that shift what we do? And that's a fascinating thing. I also remember Yoko Ashikawa actually saying something about this, because after Hijikata died in 1986, beginning 86, the Yoko Ashikawa and some of the dancers of Hakutobo lived for not a few years, lived for a short while with us at the farm and talk, just to give them a home base, I suppose. And I remember her saying that, because Hijikata's work with Ashikawa was highly choreographed, and she would say that the more I'm choreographed, the more I can improvise. So, the whole relation between choreography and improvisation is just, they just kind of go on different edges, but they come somewhere in a full circle, they come and meet each other again. So that's very interesting to think about. Does something like pure improvisation exist? No. Yes. I don't know the answer. Does it exist or not? Sorry, I lost my line. That's good. I can improvise now. I lost my line. I go to something else. I thought for a while that improvisation or dance was just a compressed part of daily life. Anything, it's just like it's more condensed in short time, in a short hour. But I'm not so sure anymore. Maybe now I think about, there's training and performance and daily life and how they relate to one another. Is maybe we do something in improvisation so we can lead our daily life differently. maybe what I'm trying to say is that it remains an open question. I think Mintanaka's answer to dance was, I don't want to fix it, put it in a box. And I'm kind of similar thinking about improvisation. I don't want to fix it. I don't want to put it in a box. I have a lot of theories around, a lot of thoughts around it. One thing is, with a computer, if you have too many programs open, then the machine starts to block and hiccup. But I think about improvisation that, actually you should dance with all your programs open, or move or perform. Meaning, how can you be in an intensity and at the same time that it doesn't pull you into something that you already know is going? How can you dance with all your programs open? So that even if you get into an intensity of performing or dancing, that it does not shut down certain channels or certain possibilities or certain options, certain choices that you get pulled into. And that, if you constantly think about being inside and being outside, then then that's an interesting way to prepare you a little bit for that. And other things about improvisation is, I really try, before I step on stage, try to throw away all my little ideas. Just let's start there, or just to try to get away from a dance of little ideas, where you think of something and do it, and think of another thing and do it. That's not what it is. No, you have to get into a zone that things come towards you, and not you have to push out material. But if you can, you bring yourself into a state, and I think that's a lifelong training, to bring yourself into a state where things come to pass through you, as a vessel almost, and you're a spokesperson or a vehicle. That's more how I think where improvisation lies. And as body weather really promotes diversity and multiplicity, and that's what I would also promote about improvisation. It's not just one style, and of course, hopefully that then would mean that I would perform different every time. And unfortunately, that's not true. I'm sure that people see me perform. They can point out some of the things that do come through. So it's a lifelong struggle, and that's good. Fortunately,
it just there at the end, it brought me back to thinking about the notion of weather again, and this people can't. Well, maybe it's true. You can't escape so easily from your own weather. I mean, your weather shifts, but you have a weather, and there's a sort of there's a dominant Frank weather, there's a dominant Neil weather, and we can do our best to kind of break this weather up. You have that weather, and then you arrive in a performance situation with the weathers of the audience, the weather of the day, and it's about maybe in the end it's about a willingness and an openness to allow the weathers to mix. Kind of full stop.
And navigating the weather a little bit, so if you know more about the weather, if you're aware of the weather, then you can just have a little bit more choice, I think. But you're right what you're saying, you can't.
Frank, I'm thinking about context when it comes to improvisation. And Neil mentioned before, and you mentioned as well, about we're always performing within a context, whether that be called weather or that be called relationship. But I'm thinking about us having a form, and I'm thinking of form and formlessness. So as an improviser, we may well have a form that's identifiable as Neil or as Frank or as Kevin. Possibly we can change that form, and we can evolve and become something else or something else's. But I'm wondering how you feel about, we do need to have a form in a way, but within that, material can emerge, and we can have a form that is identifiable, and yet we may be available to channel or to things that are coming through that form. So I'm sort of thinking there's always a context that we carry, there's always a weather we have. but we're always trying to be available at the same time. And you spoke before of being open and yet closing down because we need to land it somehow as a performance. Would you comment on that about having a form through which things can still flow versus trying to make the form so fluid that
Yeah. Wow, beautiful. Yeah, I thought about the word emerge, what you have mentioned, and I'm not quite satisfied with that term because it feels, for me, it feels a little bit passive. It feels like you're a little bit on the back end of things. I really would like to move a little bit before that. What happens before something emerge, or actually, can I capture emergence by its roots? And there's all kind of techniques we spoke about that to happen, to make that happen. But yes, you are in a context. Yes, you have a weather. Yes, you are who you are. Yes, you are limited. Yes, you are a fragile human being. Yes, but I do think there is something that you can navigate, and you can move to a point where things pour out of you freshly. And I have been commented upon by my performance that that I am very Snapchat, just keep bouncing around and different things all the time. And I actually, rather than developing a language and playing around with the language, I am very, very interested to stay as long as I can in a state where language is being born and constantly being developed and evolved, before it coagulates into a certain style or into a certain, and probably that's not possible. But doesn't mean I won't keep trying. So that's a little bit how I think about words like emergence and context and language and having a style. Yes, I do have a style and I can't escape myself, but it doesn't mean that I can't keep trying.
Right.
We're almost at the end of our time, Frank, which is sad. It feels like we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Maybe there's time for one more quick question. I was wondering, over the pandemic, of course, everything was closed down, and a lot of people were stepping into the weather of the internet. Whether that is something that you've explored and how that was.
Yeah, because it's such a physical thing, and of course dance, and it said it can't be done, but we were in that situation, so we did. There was I had for a couple months or half year, I had a weekly session of 2 hours, and it was quite interesting because you had to think differently. Everybody's locked up into their living rooms, and what was interesting was that it would unite people in that space that would normally never physically be able to meet, because there were people from the States. It was quite hard to find a good time, but people from the States and Europe and Australia, and it's quite. But then you would have a group of people that that would never work, that would never be able to be together in a physical space. And then, I really thought about it, and what we would do is lead a warm up and do that all together. And there was one thing that really worked well was the breakup groups, because performing in front of a camera or doing tasks, that doesn't really work. But if there's a group of 20 people, if you do the breakout rooms and you and I are in a space to a screen, then I can do something physical in front of the camera, you can watch, and then you do something, and then we can little talk about that. That kind of did really work. The breakout rooms were great. And that was one experience. And of course, it was very welcome because people were locked up in the room. So that little time, community time and exploring dance time was very valuable. And it was actually, thank you. It was really great. And it was different than the studio, but it was really functional, and it really helped people get through a difficult time. And sometimes, everybody would go and explore a task for 10 minutes and come back to the screen, something like that, to keep the flux going. And another thing was, I actually was a funny moment was I came back to Australia, and I was 2 weeks locked up in a hotel in Adelaide, quarantine. And then I was teaching a workshop on improvisation in Belfast from my locked up room in Adelaide. It was absolutely strange, but that was like a 3-day workshop of 4 or 5 hours. And then we would do 2 hours online, and then I would send people out on the street with different tasks and do things, do their menus and do their things, and then come back, report and process. That was another way that was quite interesting. Yeah. So yeah, no, it wasn't a real thing, but it had a real function and created a kind of community, and created some. It was actually beautiful.
I think we're going to have to draw it to an end there. It feels like we've scratched the surface of so many potential areas today that we could delve in. And I would love to keep the conversation going and going and going, but here the going stops. So
Good.
Thank you so much for today, for making yourself available, for responding to our questions, and to bringing us all into a little more knowing about body weather and improvisation.
Good. Thank you.